The morning sun cast long shadows across the Fort Bragg training grounds as Sergeant Marcus Reynolds adjusted his uniform and checked his watch. It was 600 hours, and another day of training new recruits was about to begin. Reynolds had been in the Army for 12 years, working his way up through the ranks with what he considered unwavering dedication and old-school discipline. At 34, he was known throughout the base as a tough instructor who didn't tolerate weakness or excuses. Sarah Martinez had been awake since 4:30, reviewing her training manual one last time before the day's exercises. At 22, she was one of the youngest recruits in her training company, fresh out of college with a degree in mechanical engineering. Her decision to join the military had surprised many of her friends and family, but Sarah had always been driven by a desire to serve her country and prove herself in challenging environments. She was smart, dedicated, and determined to succeed despite being one of only 3 women in her training unit. The training facility buzzed with activity as recruits gathered for their morning briefing. Reynolds stood at the front of the group, his posture rigid, and his voice commanding attention. He had a reputation for pushing recruits to their limits, believing that only through extreme pressure could soldiers be properly prepared for the realities of combat. His methods were often questioned by younger instructors, but his track record of producing disciplined soldiers had kept him in his position. "Listen up, recruits," Reynolds barked, his voice echoing across the training ground. "Today we're running advanced combat scenarios. I want to see precision, speed, and absolute attention to detail. There's no room for mistakes in real combat, and there won't be any tolerance for them here either." Sarah stood at attention with the rest of her unit, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She had been performing well in most of her training exercises, but she knew that Reynolds had been particularly hard on her and the other female recruits. She had heard whispers from other trainees about his old-fashioned views on women in combat roles, but she was determined not to let his attitude affect her performance. The first exercise involved navigating an obstacle course while carrying full combat gear. Sarah had practiced this routine dozens of times, but the added pressure of performing under Reynolds' scrutiny made every movement feel more challenging. She moved through the course methodically, focusing on proper form and timing. Her mechanical engineering background had given her an analytical approach to problem-solving that served her well in these physical challenges. As Sarah approached the rope climb section of the course, she could feel Reynolds watching her intently. She had always struggled with upper body strength compared to her male counterparts, but she had been working extra hours in the gym to improve. She gripped the rope firmly and began her ascent, using her legs to assist her climb and conserving energy for the descent. "Move faster, Martinez," Reynolds shouted from below. "In combat, hesitation gets people killed." Sarah increased her pace, but as she reached for the next grip, her hand slipped slightly on the rope. She quickly adjusted her position and continued climbing, but the momentary wobble had cost her precious seconds. She could see the disappointment in Reynolds' expression as she completed the climb and moved to the next obstacle. The training continued throughout the morning, with each exercise becoming progressively more demanding. Sarah performed adequately in most tasks, but she could sense Reynolds' growing frustration with what he perceived as her limitations. During weapons handling drills, she demonstrated excellent accuracy and technique, but Reynolds found fault with her stance and grip adjustment speed. "Your technique might look good on paper, Martinez, but pretty forms don't win battles," Reynolds commented loudly enough for the entire unit to hear. "Combat requires instinct and raw ability, not textbook knowledge." The comment stung, but Sarah maintained her composure and continued with the exercise. She had learned early in her training that responding to such provocations would only make things worse. Instead, she focused on improving her performance and proving herself through action rather than words. As the morning progressed, the temperature began to rise, and the physical demands of the training took their toll on all the recruits. Sarah noticed that she was keeping pace with most of her male counterparts, and in some exercises, she was actually performing better. Her analytical approach to each challenge allowed her to find efficient solutions that compensated for any physical disadvantages. During a tactical movement exercise, Sarah's unit was tasked with advancing through a simulated urban environment while maintaining proper cover and communication. She had studied urban warfare tactics extensively and felt confident in this particular scenario. As her team moved through the course, Sarah took the initiative to identify optimal cover positions and coordinate her squad's movement. "Martinez, fall back and let Thompson take point," Reynolds commanded over the radio. "This isn't a classroom exercise." Sarah was confused by the order, as she had been performing well in the leadership role, but she complied immediately. She watched as Thompson, one of her male counterparts, took over the position and began making the same tactical decisions she had been implementing. The irony wasn't lost on her, but she maintained her professionalism and continued to support the mission. The morning training session concluded with a debriefing where Reynolds reviewed each recruit's performance. When he reached Sarah's evaluation, his criticism was particularly harsh. He questioned her physical capabilities, her decision-making under pressure, and her overall suitability for advanced military roles. "Martinez, your academic approach to military training shows a fundamental misunderstanding of what it takes to be an effective soldier," Reynolds stated in front of the entire unit. "Combat isn't solved with equations and textbook theories. It requires physical dominance and instinctive reactions that can't be taught in a classroom." The public criticism was humiliating, but Sarah knew that responding emotionally would only validate Reynolds' assessment. She accepted his feedback professionally and resolved to work even harder to prove herself. However, several of her fellow recruits approached her after the debriefing to express their disagreement with Reynolds' harsh evaluation. "Don't let him get to you," whispered Private Johnson, one of the more experienced recruits. "Everyone can see that you're performing just as well as anyone else here. His problem isn't with your ability." The lunch break provided a temporary respite from the intense training, but Sarah found it difficult to relax. She sat with a group of fellow recruits who had become her closest friends during training. They discussed the morning's exercises and shared strategies for improving their performance in the afternoon sessions. "I don't understand why Sergeant Reynolds is so hard on you," commented Private Davis, another female recruit who had also faced harsh criticism. "Your scores are consistently in the top percentile, and you've never failed to complete an exercise." Sarah appreciated the support from her peers, but she was determined not to let the situation become a source of division within the unit. She believed that maintaining unity and focusing on their shared goals was more important than dwelling on individual grievances. The afternoon training session began with advanced marksmanship exercises. This was an area where Sarah consistently excelled, and she was looking forward to demonstrating her skills. The recruits were divided into pairs for competitive shooting drills, with each pair competing against others for accuracy and speed scores. Sarah was paired with Private Williams, one of the strongest performers in the unit. As they took their positions at the firing range, she felt confident in her ability to contribute to their team's success. The exercise required precise shooting at multiple targets while moving between different positions, simulating combat conditions. When the whistle blew to begin the exercise, Sarah moved smoothly through the course, her shots finding their marks with impressive consistency. Her engineering background had given her an intuitive understanding of ballistics and trajectory calculations, which translated into exceptional marksmanship skills. Williams matched her performance, and together they completed the course with one of the best times and accuracy scores of the day. However, when Reynolds announced the results, he seemed reluctant to acknowledge Sarah's contribution to her team's success. Instead, he praised Williams for carrying his partner through the exercise and suggested that Sarah's performance was merely adequate for the controlled conditions of the range. "Real combat doesn't provide the luxury of calculated shots and perfect conditions," Reynolds announced. "Williams showed the kind of aggressive accuracy that wins firefights. His partner managed to keep up, which is commendable, but following someone else's lead isn't the same as demonstrating combat effectiveness." The dismissive comment was particularly frustrating because Sarah had actually outscored Williams in several individual measurements, but she maintained her composure and accepted the feedback without protest. She was beginning to understand that no matter how well she performed, Reynolds seemed determined to find fault with her efforts. The final exercise of the day involved close-quarters combat training, an area where physical strength and size advantages became most apparent. Sarah had been dreading this portion of the training, knowing that it would likely provide Reynolds with additional ammunition for his criticisms. However, she had been studying combat techniques and working with instructors during her free time to develop skills that could compensate for her smaller stature. When it came time for Sarah to demonstrate her combat skills, she was paired against Private Thompson, who outweighed her by nearly 50 pounds. The exercise was designed to teach defensive techniques and proper form rather than to determine winners and losers, but the inherent physical mismatch made the demonstration challenging. Sarah focused on using leverage and technique to compensate for the size difference, employing the strategy she had been practicing. She managed to execute several successful defensive moves and even gained advantageous positions during portions of the exercise. Her performance was solid and demonstrated clear improvement from her earlier training sessions. However, when Thompson's superior size and strength eventually overwhelmed her defensive position, Reynolds used the moment to make a broader point about the realities of combat. He stopped the exercise and called the entire unit to gather around as he provided his analysis. "This is exactly what I've been trying to explain," Reynolds announced, gesturing toward Sarah and Thompson. "In real combat, enemies don't adjust their tactics to accommodate physical limitations. Size, strength, and aggressive instincts are what keep soldiers alive in close-quarters situations." Sarah felt her face burning with embarrassment as Reynolds continued his critique, but she forced herself to maintain eye contact and accept his feedback professionally. She knew that showing any emotional reaction would only reinforce his apparent belief that she wasn't suitable for military service. As the day's training concluded, Sarah found herself questioning whether she was really cut out for military life. The constant criticism and public humiliation were taking their toll on her confidence, and she wondered if Reynolds might be right about her limitations. However, the encouragement from her fellow recruits and her own determination to succeed kept her from giving up. That evening, Sarah spent extra time in the gym working on her physical conditioning. She was determined to address any legitimate weaknesses in her performance while refusing to accept that her gender made her inherently unsuitable for military service. As she worked through her exercise routine, she reflected on the events of the day and tried to develop strategies for tomorrow's challenges. Private Johnson found her in the gym and offered to help with her training. Together, they worked on combat techniques and discussed ways to improve performance in the areas where Reynolds had been most critical. The support from her peers meant more to Sarah than any official recognition, and it reinforced her belief that she belonged in the military despite one instructor's apparent prejudices. As Sarah prepared for bed that night, she made a conscious decision to continue giving her best effort regardless of the criticism she faced. She believed that her performance would eventually speak for itself, and that maintaining her integrity and professionalism was more important than seeking approval from someone whose judgment she was beginning to question. The next morning would bring new challenges and another opportunity to prove herself. Sarah fell asleep with a renewed sense of determination, unaware that the events of the following day would change everything in ways she could never have imagined. Meanwhile, across the base, other conversations were taking place that would soon intersect with Sarah's training experience. Word of Reynolds' harsh treatment of female recruits had begun to circulate among the training staff, and some senior officers were taking notice. The military's evolving policies on gender integration and equal treatment were creating new expectations for instructor conduct, but changing deeply held attitudes would prove to be a more complex challenge than updating official regulations. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only Sarah's resolve, but also the military's commitment to its stated values of equality and respect for all service members. What none of them knew was that tomorrow's events would bring these simmering tensions to a dramatic head, with consequences that would reach the highest levels of military command. The second day of advanced training began with an unusual change in the schedule. Instead of the typical morning briefing, Sergeant Reynolds announced that the recruits would be participating in an intensive evaluation exercise that would test everything they had learned during their training program. The exercise was designed to simulate real combat conditions and would be observed by several senior officers who were visiting the base. Sarah felt a mixture of anxiety and excitement about the evaluation. This was an opportunity to demonstrate her capabilities under official scrutiny, which might provide some protection from Reynolds' typically harsh criticism. She had spent extra time the previous evening reviewing tactical procedures and ensuring that her equipment was in perfect condition. The evaluation exercise took place in a large training facility that had been configured to simulate an urban combat environment. The recruits were divided into small teams and given a mission to secure a series of objectives while facing simulated enemy opposition. Each team's performance would be scored based on tactical decision-making, communication, teamwork, and individual skill execution. Sarah was assigned to a team led by Private Williams, with Private Johnson and Private Davis as the other team members. She was pleased to be working with recruits who had consistently supported her and recognized her abilities. The team quickly developed a plan that utilized each member's strengths, with Sarah taking responsibility for tactical analysis and communication coordination. As the exercise began, Sarah's team moved methodically through the simulated urban environment. Her analytical approach to the tactical situation proved valuable as she identified optimal routes and potential threat positions. The team's communication was clear and efficient, with each member contributing to their collective success. Reynolds observed the exercise from a control room with other training staff and the visiting senior officers. He watched Sarah's team with particular attention, clearly hoping to see mistakes that would validate his assessment of her limitations. However, as the exercise progressed, Sarah's team consistently outperformed the other units in both speed and tactical effectiveness. During one particularly challenging portion of the exercise, Sarah's team encountered a complex tactical situation that required quick thinking and precise execution. Enemy positions were situated in a way that made direct assault extremely dangerous, but Sarah identified a flanking route that would allow them to neutralize the threats with minimal risk. Williams, if we can get Johnson and Davis positioned on that elevated platform, they'll have clear lines of sight to both enemy positions, Sarah whispered into her radio. I can provide covering fire from this position while you advance along the eastern wall. Williams immediately recognized the tactical advantage of Sarah's plan and coordinated the team's movement accordingly. The execution was flawless, with each team member playing their role perfectly. They neutralized both enemy positions without sustaining any simulated casualties, completing the objective faster than any other team had managed in previous exercises. From the observation room, the visiting officers were clearly impressed with the team's performance. One of them, Colonel Patricia Hayes, made notes about the tactical decision-making and asked Reynolds about the team composition. Reynolds reluctantly provided the information, clearly uncomfortable with having to acknowledge Sarah's leadership role in the successful operation. The tactical analysis was particularly sophisticated, Colonel Hayes commented. Who was responsible for identifying the flanking route? Reynolds hesitated before answering. Private Martinez provided input on the tactical approach. The colonel raised an eyebrow at the obvious understatement, having observed Sarah's clear leadership in developing and communicating the strategy. She made additional notes while continuing to watch the exercise with increased interest. As Sarah's team moved to the next objective, they encountered an even more complex scenario. Multiple enemy positions were arranged in an overlapping defensive pattern that required careful coordination to overcome. Sarah quickly assessed the situation and realized that conventional tactics would likely result in heavy simulated casualties. Instead, she proposed a creative solution that involved using the environment to their advantage. By utilizing smoke grenades and coordinated movement, the team could create confusion among the defensive positions while advancing through areas that provided natural concealment. This is going to require precise timing, Sarah explained to her teammates. We need to move in sequence with each person providing cover for the next advancement. If we maintain communication and stick to the timing, we can neutralize all positions before they can coordinate their response. The plan was ambitious and required exceptional teamwork to execute successfully. Williams trusted Sarah's tactical judgment and coordinated the team's movement according to her strategy. Johnson and Davis followed their assigned roles perfectly, demonstrating the kind of unit cohesion that military training was designed to develop. The execution was spectacular. Sarah's team moved through the defensive positions like a well-oiled machine, neutralizing threats with surgical precision while maintaining constant communication. Their performance was so impressive that other training staff in the observation room stopped what they were doing to watch. Colonel Hayes was particularly impressed with the tactical creativity and execution. She turned to Reynolds and asked, "Has Private Martinez received specialized tactical training? Her approach to these scenarios is quite sophisticated." Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his chair. She has an engineering background, but no formal tactical training beyond what we provide here. The colonel made more notes while continuing to observe Sarah's performance with obvious interest. It was becoming clear to everyone in the observation room that Sarah possessed exceptional tactical abilities that went well beyond what might be expected from a basic training recruit. As the exercise continued, Sarah's team maintained their exceptional performance level. They completed each objective with efficiency and creativity, consistently demonstrating superior tactical thinking and execution. Sarah's leadership role became increasingly apparent, with her teammates naturally turning to her for strategic guidance. However, Reynolds' frustration with Sarah's success was becoming visible to the other observers. He made several critical comments about her performance that seemed disconnected from the reality of what everyone was witnessing. His attempts to downplay her contributions were becoming increasingly awkward and unprofessional. During the final phase of the exercise, Sarah's team faced their most challenging objective yet. They were tasked with rescuing a simulated hostage from a heavily defended position while minimizing both civilian casualties and their own exposure to enemy fire. The scenario was designed to test decision-making under extreme pressure with multiple competing priorities. Sarah studied the tactical situation carefully, recognizing that this scenario required balancing aggressive action with precise control. She developed a plan that utilized diversionary tactics to draw attention away from the hostage location, while a smaller element executed the actual rescue operation. "Williams, I need you and Johnson to create a distraction at the main entrance," Sarah communicated through her radio. "Make it loud and visible, but stay mobile so you can withdraw quickly. Davis and I will approach from the rear and extract the hostage while their attention is focused on you." The plan required split-second timing and absolute trust between team members. Williams and Johnson executed their diversionary attack perfectly, drawing the defensive attention exactly as Sarah had predicted. Meanwhile, Sarah and Davis approached the hostage location with stealth and precision. As Sarah reached the hostage position, she encountered an unexpected complication. The hostage was positioned in a way that made extraction difficult without exposing herself to enemy fire from multiple directions. She had to make an instant tactical decision that could determine the success or failure of the entire mission. Without hesitation, Sarah used her own position to shield the hostage while coordinating Davis's covering fire. Her quick thinking and willingness to accept personal risk allowed the team to successfully extract the hostage without casualties. The entire operation was completed in record time with textbook execution. The observation room erupted in appreciative comments from the visiting officers. Colonel Hayes was openly impressed with the tactical sophistication and leadership qualities that Sarah had demonstrated throughout the exercise. She began asking detailed questions about Sarah's training record and future assignment plans. Reynolds found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. His previous criticisms of Sarah now appeared completely unjustified in light of her exceptional performance. The visiting officers were clearly impressed with her abilities, and his attempts to minimize her contributions were beginning to damage his own credibility. As the exercise concluded, the scores were tabulated and announced. Sarah's team had achieved the highest overall score in every category, with particularly outstanding marks for tactical decision-making and leadership effectiveness. The visiting officers congratulated the team on their performance, with specific praise for the tactical creativity they had demonstrated. During the post-exercise debriefing, Colonel Hayes asked to speak with Sarah privately. She complimented her on the exceptional performance and inquired about her career goals and interests. Sarah expressed her desire to pursue advanced tactical training and eventually work in operations planning or strategic development. "Your performance today was remarkable," Colonel Hayes told Sarah. "I'd like to recommend you for advanced leadership training and possibly a fast-track promotion program. Have you considered applying for officer candidate school?" Sarah was thrilled by the recognition and the opportunity for advancement. She had always hoped that her performance would eventually speak for itself, and it seemed that her persistence was finally paying off. However, she remained humble about her achievements and expressed gratitude for the training she had received. Meanwhile, Reynolds was struggling to process the day's events. His assessment of Sarah's abilities had been completely contradicted by her performance, and the visiting officers had made it clear that they viewed her as exceptional leadership material. His credibility as a training instructor was being called into question, and he was beginning to panic about the implications for his career. As the day progressed, Reynolds became increasingly agitated about the attention that Sarah was receiving. He felt that his authority was being undermined and that his years of experience were being disregarded in favor of one impressive exercise performance. His resentment towards Sarah began to transform into something more dangerous. During the afternoon training session, Reynolds assigned Sarah to a series of individual exercises that were designed to highlight areas where her physical limitations might be more apparent. He seemed determined to find some way to undermine the positive impression she had made with the visiting officers. The exercises included heavy equipment handling, extended physical endurance challenges, and individual combat scenarios. Sarah approached each task with the same analytical mindset that had served her well throughout training, but Reynolds scrutinized every aspect of her performance with obvious hostility. When Sarah struggled with a particularly heavy piece of equipment, Reynolds immediately called attention to her difficulty. "This is exactly what I've been trying to explain about physical limitations," he announced loudly. "Real combat doesn't provide lighter alternatives when someone can't handle the standard requirements." Sarah completed the task successfully, but Reynolds' public criticism was humiliating and seemed designed to undermine her confidence. Several of her fellow recruits exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with Reynolds' increasingly personal attacks on her abilities. As the afternoon wore on, Reynolds' behavior became more erratic and unprofessional. He singled Sarah out for criticism, even when her performance was adequate or better than average. His comments became more personal and less focused on legitimate training concerns. The situation reached a boiling point during the final exercise of the day. Sarah was participating in a combat simulation that required her to navigate through a challenging obstacle course while carrying full equipment. She was performing well and maintaining pace with her male counterparts when she encountered a particularly difficult obstacle. As Sarah worked to overcome the challenge, using technique and persistence to compensate for any physical disadvantages, Reynolds became increasingly agitated. His frustration with her continued success, despite his predictions, seemed to overwhelm his professional judgment. "Martinez, you're holding up the entire exercise," Reynolds shouted, even though Sarah was actually keeping pace with the other recruits. "This is exactly the kind of hesitation that gets people killed in combat." Sarah increased her pace and successfully completed the obstacle, but Reynolds wasn't finished. He approached her directly as she prepared for the next challenge, his face red with anger and frustration. "I've been trying to teach you reality for weeks, Martinez, but you seem determined to prove something that can't be proven," Reynolds said, his voice rising. "Your little performance this morning doesn't change the fundamental facts about physical limitations in combat situations." Sarah maintained her composure despite the personal nature of the attack. "I understand your concerns, Sergeant, and I'm committed to continuing to improve my performance in all areas." Her professional response seemed to enrage Reynolds even more. In his mind, her refusal to acknowledge his assessment was a personal challenge to his authority and expertise. The visiting officer's praise for her abilities had wounded his pride, and he was looking for a way to reassert his dominance. "Don't give me that textbook response," Reynolds snapped. "You think because you impressed some visiting officers with one good exercise that you've proven something. Real combat is going to crush that academic confidence of yours." The confrontation was becoming increasingly uncomfortable for the other recruits, who could see that Reynolds was crossing professional boundaries. His personal animosity toward Sarah was becoming obvious, and his behavior was reflecting poorly on his ability to serve as an effective instructor. Sarah tried to defuse the situation by focusing on the training exercise, but Reynolds seemed determined to continue the confrontation. His behavior was becoming erratic and unprofessional, setting the stage for an incident that would have consequences far beyond anything he could imagine. The tension in the air was palpable as other recruits watched nervously, unsure whether they should intervene or continue with their training. What none of them realized was that this confrontation was about to escalate in a way that would change everything for everyone involved. The breaking point was approaching, and when it arrived, the consequences would reach levels of military command that Reynolds had never dreamed possible. His authority was about to be challenged in a way that would expose not just his personal prejudices, but also the broader issues of leadership and accountability within the military training system. The tension between Sergeant Reynolds and Sarah Martinez had been building throughout the week, but what happened next would shock everyone present and set in motion a chain of events that would reach the highest levels of military command. As the afternoon training session continued, Reynolds' behavior became increasingly erratic and unprofessional, his personal vendetta against Sarah overriding his military training and judgment. Sarah was attempting to complete the final obstacle in the combat course when Reynolds positioned himself directly in her path, continuing his verbal assault. His face was flushed with anger, and his voice carried across the entire training ground as he berated her performance. "You think you're proving something here, Martinez, but all you're doing is wasting everyone's time," Reynolds shouted, stepping closer to her position. "Your little show this morning was just beginner's luck, and everyone knows it." The other recruits had stopped their own exercises to watch the confrontation unfold. The situation was clearly spiraling out of control, and several of them exchanged worried glances. Private Williams took a step forward as if to intervene, but hesitated, knowing that interfering with a training instructor could have serious consequences for his own military career. Sarah tried to maintain her composure despite the increasingly personal nature of Reynolds' attacks. She had endured weeks of his criticism and harassment, but something about his demeanor today felt different, more dangerous. Still, she responded with the same professionalism she had maintained throughout her training. "Sergeant, I'm committed to completing the exercise to the best of my ability," Sarah said calmly, trying to step around him to continue with the course. "I understand your concerns about my performance, and I'm working to address any deficiencies." Her calm, professional response seemed to enrage Reynolds even further. In his mind, her refusal to break down or admit defeat was a personal challenge to his authority. The praise she had received from the visiting officers that morning had wounded his pride deeply, and he was determined to reassert his dominance over the situation. "Don't you dare walk away from me when I'm talking to you," Reynolds snarled, grabbing Sarah's arm to prevent her from moving past him. "You think you can just ignore what I'm telling you because some desk officers were impressed by your little performance." The physical contact crossed a clear line of professional conduct, and Sarah instinctively pulled her arm free from his grip. The action was reflexive and defensive, but Reynolds interpreted it as further defiance of his authority. His anger reached a boiling point, and his military training and judgment completely abandoned him. What happened next occurred so quickly that most witnesses would later struggle to provide accurate accounts of the sequence of events. Reynolds, consumed by rage and feeling that his authority was being challenged, raised his hand and struck Sarah across the face with an open palm. The sound of the slap echoed across the training ground, instantly silencing all other activity. Sarah staggered backward from the force of the blow, her hand instinctively moving to her cheek, where a red mark was already beginning to form. The shock of the assault left her momentarily speechless, unable to process what had just happened. Around the training ground, the other recruits stood frozen in disbelief, their faces reflecting the horror and confusion they all felt. Reynolds immediately realized the magnitude of what he had done, but his anger and pride prevented him from backing down. Instead, he attempted to justify his actions by claiming that Sarah had been insubordinate and needed to learn respect for military authority. His voice shook as he tried to rationalize the assault. "That's what happens when you refuse to follow orders and show proper respect," Reynolds said, his voice lacking conviction even as he spoke the words. "Maybe now you'll understand what military discipline really means." The training ground remained eerily silent except for the sound of Reynolds' heavy breathing. The other recruits were still processing what they had witnessed, unsure of how to respond to such an unprecedented situation. Several of them looked toward Private Williams, who had emerged as an informal leader among the recruits, but he appeared as shocked and uncertain as everyone else. Sarah slowly lowered her hand from her face, revealing the clear handprint that marked where Reynolds had struck her. Her eyes showed pain and shock, but also a determination that Reynolds had failed to break despite weeks of harassment and intimidation. When she spoke, her voice was steady and clear, carrying across the silent training ground. "I will report this incident to the appropriate authorities immediately," Sarah said, making direct eye contact with Reynolds. "What you just did was assault, not military discipline." Reynolds' face turned an even deeper shade of red as he realized that Sarah was not going to be intimidated into silence. His career was now in serious jeopardy, and his panic made him even more aggressive and irrational. He stepped toward Sarah again, raising his hand as if to strike her a second time. "You'll report nothing," Reynolds snarled. "Who do you think they're going to believe? A respected instructor with 12 years of service or some recruit who can't handle real military training?" Before Reynolds could follow through on his threat, Private Williams finally overcame his shock and stepped between them. Despite the risk to his own career, he could not stand by and watch a fellow recruit be assaulted by someone in a position of authority. "Sergeant, I think you need to step back," Williams said firmly, positioning himself protectively in front of Sarah. "This situation has gone too far." Reynolds turned his fury toward Williams, seeing his intervention as further evidence that his authority was being undermined. "Stand down, Private, or you'll face charges for interfering with military discipline." But Williams held his ground, and several other recruits began moving to support him. The solidarity among the recruits was clear, and Reynolds found himself facing not just one defiant trainee, but an entire unit that was rejecting his authority. His isolation was complete, and his panic was evident. What none of them knew was that the confrontation was being observed from an unexpected source. Unknown to everyone on the training ground, General Patricia Morrison had arrived at Fort Bragg for an unannounced inspection visit. The four-star general had built her career on ensuring that military standards of conduct and professionalism were maintained at all levels, and she took particular interest in training programs that were integrating female recruits. General Morrison had been walking through the base with her aide, Colonel Stevens, when they heard the commotion from the training ground. Her initial intention was simply to observe the training exercise from a distance, but as she approached, she witnessed the entire confrontation between Reynolds and Sarah. The general had seen Reynolds grab Sarah's arm, witnessed the assault, and heard every word of the threatening conversation that followed. Her face was a mask of controlled fury as she processed what she had just observed. In her 30-year military career, she had never witnessed such a blatant abuse of authority and violation of military standards. Colonel Stevens started to speak, but General Morrison silenced him with a sharp gesture. She wanted to observe how the situation developed and see whether any of the base's command structure would respond appropriately to the crisis. Her assessment of the entire training program would depend on how this incident was handled. On the training ground, Reynolds was still attempting to regain control of the situation through intimidation and threats. He seemed oblivious to the fact that his career was already over, and that his actions had created a crisis that would require intervention from the highest levels of command. "All of you will forget what happened here," Reynolds announced to the assembled recruits. "This was a training exercise in handling stress and following orders under pressure. Anyone who reports otherwise will face serious consequences." The attempt to frame the assault as a legitimate training exercise was so outrageous that several recruits audibly gasped. Sarah maintained her composure, but her determination to report the incident was clearly unwavering. She knew that accepting Reynolds' version of events would not only betray her own principles, but would also endanger future female recruits who might face similar treatment. "I will not participate in covering up an assault," Sarah stated clearly. "What happened here was wrong, and pretending otherwise won't make it right." Reynolds' response was to take another threatening step towards Sarah, but before he could reach her, a new voice cut through the tension like a blade. The voice carried absolute authority and left no doubt about who was speaking. "Sergeant Reynolds, step away from that recruit immediately." Everyone on the training ground turned to see General Morrison striding toward them with Colonel Stevens close behind. Her four-star insignia was clearly visible, and her bearing left no doubt about her rank and authority. Reynolds' face went white as he realized that his assault on Sarah had been witnessed by one of the most senior officers in the military. The general's presence transformed the entire dynamic of the situation. Reynolds snapped to attention, but his military bearing could not hide the fear and panic that showed clearly in his eyes. He knew that his career was over, and he understood that he was about to face consequences that extended far beyond losing his position as a training instructor. "General Morrison, I can explain," Reynolds began, but the general cut him off with a gesture. "You will not speak unless I ask you a direct question," General Morrison commanded, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from decades of military leadership. "Colonel Stevens, please escort Sergeant Reynolds to the base command center and ensure that he remains there under guard until further notice." As Colonel Stevens moved to comply with the order, General Morrison turned her attention to Sarah. The general's expression softened slightly as she approached the young recruit who had shown such courage and professionalism despite being assaulted by someone in a position of authority. "Are you injured, Private Martinez?" General Morrison asked, her voice showing genuine concern while maintaining its commanding presence. "No, ma'am," Sarah replied, snapping to attention despite the red mark still visible on her face. "I'm ready to continue with training if required." General Morrison studied Sarah's bearing and composure with obvious approval. Even after being assaulted and threatened, the young recruit maintained her military bearing and professionalism. The general could see the qualities that had impressed the visiting officers earlier that day. "You will report to the base medical facility for examination and documentation of your injuries," General Morrison ordered. "Then you will provide a full written statement about what occurred here today. Your courage in standing up to abuse of authority reflects the highest standards of military service." The general then addressed the other recruits who had witnessed the assault. "Each of you will also provide written statements about what you observed here today. I want detailed accounts of everything you saw and heard. There will be no retaliation for honest testimony, and anyone who attempts to intimidate witnesses will face serious consequences." As the recruits began to disperse to follow the general's orders, General Morrison took a moment to speak privately with Private Williams. She had observed his intervention on Sarah's behalf and recognized the courage it had taken for him to stand up to a superior officer. "Your willingness to protect a fellow soldier despite the personal risk demonstrates exceptional character," General Morrison told Williams. "The military needs leaders who will do what's right even when it's difficult." The immediate crisis was being handled with the efficiency and professionalism that characterized General Morrison's leadership style. However, the broader implications of what had occurred would require extensive investigation and systemic changes to prevent similar incidents in the future. Within hours of the incident, Reynolds was formally charged with assault, conduct unbecoming a non-commissioned officer, and abuse of authority. His military career was effectively over, and he faced both military court-martial proceedings and potential civilian criminal charges. The speed and decisiveness of the response sent a clear message throughout the base about the military's commitment to protecting service members from abuse. Sarah's statement provided a detailed account of not only the assault, but also the pattern of harassment and discrimination she had endured throughout her training. Her documentation of Reynolds' behavior revealed a systemic problem that extended beyond a single incident of violence. The investigation that followed uncovered evidence that Reynolds' treatment of female recruits had been problematic for years, but previous complaints had been dismissed or covered up by commanders who shared his prejudices. General Morrison's intervention had not only stopped an assault in progress, but had also exposed a broader pattern of discrimination and abuse. Within a week, Reynolds was removed from his position and confined pending court-martial proceedings. Several other training staff members who had enabled his behavior were also reassigned or disciplined. The entire training program underwent review and restructuring to ensure that all recruits received equal treatment and respect. Sarah's courage in refusing to be intimidated and her determination to report the assault despite threats of retaliation made her a symbol of the military's evolving commitment to equality and justice. Her exceptional performance during training exercises, combined with her character under pressure, led to immediate recommendations for advanced leadership training. General Morrison personally ensured that Sarah's career advancement was fast-tracked, and she became one of the youngest recruits ever selected for officer candidate school. Her analytical approach to tactical problems and her demonstrated leadership abilities made her an ideal candidate for the military's future leadership needs. The incident also led to broader policy changes throughout the military training system. New protocols were established for reporting and investigating harassment complaints, and training staff received enhanced instruction on professional conduct and equality standards. The message was clear that abuse of authority would not be tolerated at any level. Years later, Sarah would reflect on that moment when Reynolds struck her as a turning point not just in her own career, but in the military's commitment to living up to its stated values. The courage she showed in that moment, and the decisive action taken by General Morrison, demonstrated that justice and accountability could prevail even in institutions with long histories of discrimination and abuse. Reynolds' assault on Sarah had lasted only seconds, but the consequences of that moment of violence would resonate throughout the military for years to come. The incident proved that no one was above accountability, and that the military's commitment to equality and respect for all service members was more than just words in a policy manual. The young woman who had been struck by a training instructor would go on to become one of the military's most respected leaders, while the man who had assaulted her would serve as a cautionary tale about the consequences of allowing prejudice and anger to override professional judgment and basic human decency.